Learning Programming with Tim Corey.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Before we start, I want to put out a personal message. For those of you who have followed my work and content for some time, you know that I started ClearMeasure 10 years ago. We're a software architecture company, and that's the type of consulting we do to help in-house teams be great, to jumpstart them along their way. So all of our work is programming in all of its various forms, and we've done a tremendous amount of DevOps and cloud automation work as well. And we're the North American consulting partner for Octopus Deploy. Now, I haven't done this very often, but I'm putting out a call for anyone who'd like to work with me. We've been running on a backlog of projects for quite a while now, and we need to grow. We need some more .NET software engineers, DevOps engineers who have Octopus Deploy experience and Microsoft Cloud experience. And we're also in need of a few more experienced software architects. And if you followed me for any length of time, you probably understand how I think about software. And if you like the way I think about it, then you'll absolutely love working with me at ClearMeasure. We need to hire some people pretty immediately. So if this has piqued your attention, please go ahead and apply online on the website. And if you have any questions, just send me an email at Jeffrey, Jeffrey, at clear-measure.com. And thank you for indulging me with the interruption. And here's our regularly scheduled episode. Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company that empowers .NET teams to be highly effective and able to deliver world-class results through its ClearMeasure Way methodology. Quick announcement, my architect forums are still going strong. Signups for the next session are up. And if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with peer architect leaders, then just go ahead and sign up at the link in the show notes. And if you're looking for the Programming with Palermo show, my video podcast, you can just search in any of the directories or on YouTube and you'll be able to find it. My guest today on the show is Tim Corey. Tim learned software development the hard way, he reports, with lots of dead ends and confusion and knowledge gaps. He kept thinking, it shouldn't be this hard. And now he teaches students how to think and code like professional developers. His goal is to make it easier for others to become a developer. And he's also been recognized by Microsoft as an MVP, as a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional every year since 2017. And he has a very popular video channel on YouTube, I Am Tim Corey. And he also has a website, IamTimCorey.com. And he has just a plethora of developer courses and tons of content about learning to code and just every kind of .NET development under the sun. And so he does just an absolute ton of teaching there. But Tim, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well today.
Awesome. Well, glad to have you. I want to kind of ask you about, all the work that you do in teaching. But, before we get into that, for people who kind of haven't seen your channel or haven't, learned from you, take us back to when you were learning programming. Where did it start? And what was the high points along the way that kind of led you into focusing on teaching?
Accidents, lots and lots of accidents. That was kind of the theme of my career. So I started when I was 12. My grandfather gave me a computer. Didn't have a hard drive. It was two 5.25. Is it floppy drives?
The big ones, yeah.
I forget. It was just a terminal. It didn't have an operating system. You had to put one floppy in order to get the operating system running. And He was like, "Here, have this." And so I started to learn to program in BASIC because I'm like, hey, I could build something. And that was kind of the start of my scratching that itch. I want to write code. Mm-hmm. And so, in high school, I carried that on. I actually interned for an electrical engineer in high school. And I he had a lot of grunt work for me to do, but I blew through it because I wanted to, my thought was I'm lazy. And so I didn't want to do the work of repetition.
Yeah.
And so I figured out how to automate that. And so I blew through all his work, and he's like, well, let me just find something else for you to do. And so he started giving me his little projects to create applications. And that's really what sparked that. I started building full applications to help them out. And so, it was a rough start. I was self-taught, but I went to school for a year, dropped out to pay for it. I didn't want to go into debt. And the guy I'd interned with said, hey, do you want a job as a full-time software developer? And I'm like, well, sure. I mean, that sounds awesome. And so I became a consultant, and he was really good about throwing me in the deep end. He'd be like, hey, figure this out. And so I would have to figure out how to do it. And so I learned on the job, just trying to figure stuff out. And one of the things that always stuck with me was I was never good enough. There's always that nagging feeling of I don't know everything. I'd go to conferences and really keep my mouth shut because I'd be standing around talking to people and they'd say stuff and I'm like, I don't know what that is, but they're acting like this is fundamental knowledge.
Yeah.
And that was kind of intimidating. And so I'd, come back, I'd try and research that thing and figure out how that works. But, life happens and you got to keep moving and doing, the job. And so I just kind of learned as I went, but had all these gaps of, for a long time, I didn't use source control. We just, you zip up the files and you're good to go.
Right.
And takes a lot of extra time and effort and a lot of extra pain, but you can do it. And so that's what I did. I didn't know any better. It wasn't until, I came across it, really someone taught me like, hey, this is important. Here's why that the kind of the light bulb went off. And I'm like, oh, I need to learn that, even though it's not necessarily today's job to do.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that stuff. And as I progressed in my career, I started, backfill all of the areas that I was missing. But it took a long time. It was a lot of, I learned the wrong way of doing things. And I would show that off and people were like, that's stupid. There's a better way, and so, again, that's intimidating. It's intimidating to be told the way you're doing things is wrong. Now, and part of that is if it gets the job done, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
Like the number one thing is get the job done.
There's a lot of opinion out there.
There are ways to do this better. And so I started to learn those things and I realized, there's an easier way. And so I started teaching at a community college. I taught C#. And, the professor that was over me gave me a book and said, hey, teach this. And I looked at the book and went, hey, that's rough. Because the first thing it taught you was win forms. And okay, drag and drop a button, drag and drop a field. Okay, let's make the button say, hello, Tim.
Yeah.
The problem is it's all magic. It's, when it breaks, what do you do? And so invariably what would happen is you would like double click on the form instead of the button and create an event. And you're like, oop, that's not the right one. I delete that. Now the form doesn't work even in designer mode. And so, it would confuse students. And they didn't understand about classes and instantiation and events and all the things you need to for chapter 1. Yeah. And so I kind of rewrote it. And we actually went through chapter 8 before we went through chapter 1 because of the fact that chapter 8 was about objects and instantiation and all the rest. And so that's when I really started to kind of build on that knowledge and say, hey, here I can share my knowledge and share real world how I can make this easier. And then my students, I taught them once a week in the evenings for 3 hours. And that's a fire hose.
Okay.
That's rough. So what I did is I created some YouTube videos to say, hey, here's what we covered this week. So you can kind of refer back to it throughout the week to refresh yourself as you're practicing. You are practicing, right? So I started doing that. And again, my class size was 20, 25 students at a time. And at first, that's all I'd get as far as number of hits. I'd get, 10, 20, 30 hits a week. And then I started getting 500 hits and 1,000 hits. And I'm like, that's not my students. Like, my students are great, but they're not that dedicated to watching my stuff. And so I started to find people saying this is really helpful. And I didn't mean it to be helpful for them. I actually focused it entirely on this is what we learn in class. But I'm like, sure, I'd love to, help you guys. So I started creating videos that were more community oriented instead of just class oriented. And that's what started taking off. And at the time I was working full time plus teaching part time plus doing some consulting. And so I didn't have a lot of time for creating videos. And so I said, hey, you know what? If I could get a little extra income, I could replace my consulting income and have more time. So I sold my first course thinking that no one would buy it. And actually, I gave away the entire course video content for free on YouTube. You can still find it on YouTube. And I said, but if you want the source code, if you want to, watch the videos, downloadable and that kind of stuff, it's $67. And blew the doors off. I blew my mind. I was like, I can't believe anyone would buy this stuff. Because I give away for free, but it was the convenience of I want it all now. And some of it was, I want to support what you're doing. I was very clear. The reason I'm doing this is because if I have more money, I can replace the income. And so I could give more time to the channel. And so I did. And that kind of snowballed until I was working full time and doing just YouTube as my side job. And that was making more income than my day job was. And so I said, hey, then I'll go full time and spend even more time on the channel and again, give back more to the community. And that's, snowballed to where we are today, where I, just hired my 4th employee to help with that. But our mission, we're very careful in our mission that our first mission is to help people. Our second mission is to make money. Without money, I can't pay for employees. I can't pay for my time. I can't, but that's not the goal. The primary goal is how many people can we help? Because there's an awful lot of people in this world who can't afford. And so we can still help give them a great education in C#, help make it easier to learn C#. And so it's kind of what we do and why we do it. And that's kind of the high points where we are today.
Nice. Well, and it's, I think your channel's all over the place now. I mean, it's just from, anecdotal, you've gotten such a huge reach. So there's some young programmers, I'm talking, middle school or maybe early high school, and their parents that have asked me this question. I want to kind of pose it to you. And they'll say, hey, Mike, interested in programming, what language should I learn? And you've done a ton around .NET. My whole career has been Microsoft platform. But, what's your answer to that type of question?
The one you resonate with. There's not really a wrong answer to where to start, because in my career, I stopped counting at 20 plus languages that I've developed in. Now I was a consultant, so I bounced around a lot and did a lot of weird languages. But languages come and go, platforms come and go, systems come and go. It's more about, hey, how do you learn that logic? How do you implement that logic? In my class, I had a 16-week class. The first 5 weeks, we learned about 90% of all syntax for C# that you'd need. Okay. Because it's not about the syntax. It's not about, knowing how to form an if statement. It's about knowing why to use an if statement. And so that's the important part, is find something that works well for you, and then, build in that language and stick with it. Because it's not about learning just the syntax of here's how to create something in C#. It's about learning how to, put together an application, put together the logic to start from an idea and end with a finished product that actually does what you intended it to do. And so I love C# for that. It's a very high level language. It's really beginner friendly. It allows you to get in and start writing code immediately that makes sense. I use console applications to start teaching people, because there's a lot of user interfaces. It's like, okay, you have 30 minutes of setup. You have to configure this and configure that and import these libraries and do this stuff and stop. That's way too much. You really want to have just that simple file that you say, okay, write code here to start learning.
Yeah, wasn't that the experience in BASIC on the IBM clone computer with the floppy disk? It was just a command line, right?
Just a command line. Yep. That a little intimidating, but yes, it was. So, you pick whatever language, fits you best. If you try C# and you're like, I hate this, no problem, try a different language. But the big thing is don't get too stuck in this is my life choice. I mean, my goodness, C# wasn't around when I started coding. And, I've changed major languages multiple times because of the world changes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when your students are going through the progression, do they normally start having never programmed before? I know you got all types, but more than half of them, do they fall into a particular persona, or are these, hey, they've been programmers for a while and now they come back and take a few courses? What are the trends?
Yeah, I have two major buckets for people. One is the I'm just learning how do I get started people. And so, yeah, you start from the basics. We have a course, the C# Master Course, that starts them from knowing nothing and takes them to I can be a software developer professionally. But the other bucket is the people who have been around for a while that were kind of like me, that I've been doing it for 10 years or whatever, but I have all these gaps in my knowledge.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times they'll actually go back to the C# Master Course, even though they're professional developers who are getting paid to do C#, because they're like, this is filling in gaps for me that I missed.
Yeah.
Whether it's learning how to debug better and, advanced breakpoints, or it's learning more about object-oriented programming and why it's important and how it works.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. So there's kind of both camps that appear quite a bit that we help.
That's a good point. I remember 18 years ago now, Jeffrey Richter wrote the book called, it was Applied .NET Runtime. Really dry title, Applied .NET Runtime. But he had worked in Microsoft consulting with the runtime team. And that book was where I learned the different levels of garbage collection and how app domains actually spin up and translate from intermediate language into the machine language just in time. But I just, I need to read this book. It was all the internals, but you never even come across that. I don't know any coding schools, and certainly none of my formal education even touched on the internals of any of the languages of any of the courses. So you're right. There's always going to be gaps. You got to fill them in somewhere.
Yep.
So I want you to comment on a trend that we've seen over the last, it's been going on for many decades, but the recent developer surveys that I've seen have the industry doubling in the number of programmers over the last 7 years. And then the 7 years prior to that, it had doubled. So that means that if you were working as a programmer before 14 years ago, you're in like the small minority of highest experience level just because of the massive number of programmers that have come into the field. And so what is your view on how programmers should be educated? There's tons of coding schools that have come up. The universities are trying to ramp up their computer science programs. And then yet you hear all those stories of people having not gone to any formal education whatsoever. And they're, a well-employed programmer. So
that's me.
I was self-taught early before I even had my first job too. So, I guess all of us old guys, that's just the way it was. Because all the coding schools, that's more of a recent phenomenon.
Sure.
Because the colleges haven't kept up. But there's a return on investment of university, and then there's the 6-week boot camps and all that. How do you reason about all that versus just look, self-teach? Buy some highly affordable videos and just practice.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
So we wrestle this a lot because obviously there can be a little bias on my end. I sell teaching, therefore it must be the best.
Sure.
And I try to make it the best. But the reality is it's going to have to be, the consultant answer. It depends. It depends on your situation and what you find is best for you. Personally, I am less and less and less of a fan of college just because of the enormous cost. And we're talking US here, not necessarily around the world, but the enormous cost, even in time. It's 4 years of your time. And then in the US, you're talking at least $100,000 plus in order to get your 4-year degree. And at the end of that, you're not a great programmer. Mm-hmm. It's not like they've turned out this product where you walk in and you're already ready to take on the world.
Right.
I used to teach new developers who came into an organization. I teach them how to, get up to speed. And it was, okay, you've got 3% of the knowledge you need. Mm-hmm. Let's get you to 97% of the real world.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I really focus on is forget the theory, forget the, all the stuff that sounds great, but at the end of the day is just academic. Let's talk about how do you actually get into your job, work with Git. How do you work with C#? How do you build something? How do you, create a pull request and put it into production? Like all the stuff that's you're really going to have to do that doesn't feel like the colleges and universities have kept up on. And I used to work at a college, and I've seen it from that perspective. It's really hard, academically to get something through from idea into the classroom in less than 3 years.
Yeah.
Well, what's 3 years in programming terms? It's obsolete at that point. So, I'm not a big fan of that. I may have unduly influenced my sons, neither of which were going to go to college. So my oldest, started working right away as a software developer, just went right into it because he could. So he's going to spend 4 years working and getting work experience and getting, better at becoming a software developer by actually doing the job and all these things. And then his comparable person who went to college is going to come out of college with $60,000 in debt that they're going to have to pay off for the rest of their life and 4 years behind. Well, doesn't feel great. Now there are benefits to college though. Having a degree, some companies are really stuck on you have to have a 4-year degree as part of their just checkbox. Yes, you're qualified. So yes, there's a benefit there, but it's unfortunately it's an awful high bar for a check mark.
Yeah.
Just to say. So as far as coding boot camps go, it depends on the person. So some people do really well. And they can go through 3 months or 6 months of a boot camp where they're really in depth, 60, 70 hours a week, cramming stuff in their brains, and that works for them. And if it does, they come out knowing a lot of stuff in a short amount of time and for a lot less money. We're talking $10,000 to $20,000. So that can be really valuable. And sometimes people really need to have that person over their shoulder saying, do this now. And you have this due date, do it. So if that's what works for you, then that's, a cheaper alternative that gets you a better result, I think, as long as you choose the right one. There's a lot of scams out there, unfortunately, with anything in education. But, then there's what I do, which is I sell a course. It's $500 and it will teach you from, nothing to being a professional software developer and, however long you want to take. I have a if you buy the course, you get it's called a year of coding, which is basically just a number of videos come out once a week that say, hey, okay, do this now. And here's why. And we talk through it. And so it's a year. And by the end of that year, you've gone through the entire main course. Plus you've learned some extra and done some extra practice and learned some other practices like looking back over what you've learned and kind of reflecting on where I was and where I am now, because often in the journey of learning software development, it's hard because you're always looking at that mountain ahead of you. I've got so far to go and you never reach the top. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have not yet conquered C#. I have not yet conquered all there is to know. And so there's always this mountain in front of you. But if you look back at how far you've come, that encourages you and it helps you continue on. You go, yeah, I actually am making progress. And so there's stuff like that we do. But, if you can do self-paced, if you can do not necessarily a person over your shoulder, then that's great. And if you don't have the time to go full time at a boot camp, there you go. But then there's also the group of people who just don't have the money. And I tell people this all the time. I give a lot of my content away. I give the outlines of all my courses away and say, hey, here's the outline.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't, buy the course and get the convenience, here's the outline. Go figure out how to do all these things on the internet, because quite frankly, everything's available on the internet for free practically.
Mm-hmm.
You can learn all of C# on the internet for free, for sure. It takes more time. And that's what I tell people is you're going to pay for your education.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to pay with your money, or you're going to pay with your time.
Yeah.
And so making that wise decision about, if I'm going to spend 3 years self-learning and then get a job, or I can spend a year with some paid content and getting a job 2 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how much are you going to make of that job? You make $40,000 a year. Well, how soon do you pay back what you would have saved if you had been time only? Yeah. So it all depends on the person. It depends on your situation. And so that's why I try, my YouTube channel has 500 plus videos now, mm-hmm. Because I really try hard to give you that option to be self-taught, to do it on your own, because there's a number of people in this world that just can't afford to do anything but pay their time. Yeah. And so I'll give you the opportunity to pay with your time and help you as much as I can with that. But then, that's what we do it for funding is we say, hey, if you want the shortcut, pay with your money. But again, it comes back to what's good for you.
Yeah. You had mentioned seeing the progress and knowing that you're progressing and looking at how far you've come, but also what you still have to learn. I'll just speak for myself, and you kind of alluded to it. The more I've learned, I guess I'm 27 years in, 26 years as a programmer. The more I learn, the more my perspective has increased, and I am aware of that much more that I have yet to learn. And some people, they call it the impostor syndrome. They realize oh, I'm less competent now than I was 2 years ago. Why? Oh, because you're just aware of how much more you don't know.
Sure.
And kind of have to be wary about the younger programmers who think, all right, I've learned everything I need to know now. No, that's just because your perspective hasn't widened for you to be aware of all the rest of the stuff.
Yeah. And the other side of it is that as a younger developer, when you have that imposter syndrome as well, where you're like, I'll never catch up, or I'll never be, to realize that we all do. I think it was my first MVP conference. So, I was in a room of thousands of people who were supposedly the top tier people of knowing how to be developers. And of mm-hmm. course, I am looking at this being super intimidated. Like I am the lowest of the low in this elite group of people. And then there's people on stage who are, even higher because they're presenting to the people that mm-hmm. are the top tier. And I don't know if it was Scott Hanselman, I think it was, that said, I'm an imposter. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, so if you get to that level mm-hmm. where you have in theory achieved a higher level of, that I can achieve.
Right.
And you say, yeah, I'm still an imposter, then maybe it's okay for me to be an imposter, and that's one of the things. I have a series on Thursdays. I have a podcast. It's also a video mm-hmm. podcast and called Dev Questions. And I had to answer developer questions. And that was one of the first questions I answered. It was about being an imposter. And I'm like, it's okay. It's absolutely okay to feel like you don't know anything mm-hmm. because none of us do. And like you said, the more you learn, the more you realize, man, this is a big field.
Right.
And people ask me sometimes, they see me on YouTube, they see me in front of a conference speaking, and they're like, you must know everything, which I remember feeling that way. And then I realized that if they let me speak, then that's not true. But they'll ask me questions and I'm like, I don't know. I just don't know. And I'm okay with that, but it took a long time to be okay with that, to say, I don't know. And that's not an attack against me personally as a developer. I just don't know about a lot of stuff.
Isn't it more accurate maybe to say when you get to a certain experience level, you've learned enough and now you know how to learn the rest.
I think so. I think the big thing for me was learning what I didn't know. You don't know what you don't know until you find out. But then yes, once you start to learn enough, you're like, okay, I can be confident to figure out how the rest works. That's why, when I first started, I was just a VB4 developer, early days, and then my boss gave me a job, and it's in Fox Pro or it's in whatever, and I'd be like, I don't know this language, and he's like, well, figure it out.
You don't know it yet.
And so I started doing that a few times. Like I said, I lost count over 20 languages, and what I started to realize was I know the questions to ask.
Yeah.
And if I know the questions to ask, I can find the answers. So yeah, it started to get to the point where I'm like, okay, I don't know this new language at all, but I can ask the right questions and get to the right answers and give me 80% of the way there. So yeah, it's the more you know, the more you really don't know, but you can definitely ask the right questions.
Yeah. And some of the concepts have stabilized. I think back in the 2006 or 7 timeframe, there was so many conference talks and debates and blog posts and this about how code should be talking to a relational database. And In Hibernate was the most popular open source project, and the SQL Server team came out with the very first version of Entity Framework, but they approached it from a totally different direction and then linked to SQL, and it still took like 6 years for Microsoft's version to shake out. Now, finally in 23, it's not so much a debate of, how should we talk to a relational database? That's kind of built in now. You kind of use Entity Framework, right? and, unless you have some other things, maybe use Dapper to go low level or whatnot. But I look back to the age of electricity when electricity was new and, another building just got hooked up with electricity. What does that mean? And versus oil lamps. And if you worked in the field of electricity, there was no regulations. And whereas now you've got your residential electrician, you've got your construction electrician, you've got your electrical substation technician, you've got electrical engineers, and there's so much regulations and checklists and how do you inspect things? And you've got standards for what a breaker is, different amperages of breakers that are well known, the box that the breakers go in. There's so many things that are not being argued about these days. But in programming, there's still a huge amount of things where the experts, when you go in that room and maybe sit down at a table, you could debate how something should be. And there's no shortage of topics where we programmers are still debating, how should it be? And then the people who are trying to learn, they just want to ask the question, hey, how should it be? Just tell me. And they need to know that, wait, hold on. The experts are still debating a lot of things.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's one of the things I love about programming is that there's not just, we're not putting, tab A into slot B over and over and over again on an assembly line. You could really look at it this way: is every business application in the world has 2 jobs: capture information, display information. That's kind of their jobs. And so when you boil it down, you're like, why isn't every application the same? But there's different. Everything's different. Every situation is different, which is why it depends is actually such a valid answer, even if it's frustrating, because you come into a situation, you're like, well, for you, this works best. I tell my students, don't get overwhelmed with all the design patterns and all the ways to make a, quote unquote, perfect application when you need to do a hello world application. Write console, write line, hello world. I actually have a video on YouTube where I create the perfect console application. So we spent, I think, like 45 minutes. And actually it's very valuable. You talk about how to put dependency injection into a console application, how to do logging and talk to app settings, I believe, and a whole bunch of other stuff that can be really valuable for a console application. But at the end of the day, it says hello world.
Yeah.
And so you spend all this time and all this code and it says hello world. And I'm like, okay, so here's a life lesson here. It depends is important because in a small application, you don't need to have all this stuff.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that I think that's a big thing I like is the fact that there is that flexibility. Now, when you're learning, like you're talking about, that can be really messy and intimidating. But the big thing for me, the thing I push is, hey, you know what? If it gets the job done, at the end of the day, you've succeeded. Congratulations.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's super ugly, if, you've got this 1,000-line switch statement that has, all this code inside it. Yeah, that's a mess. And we'd love to see it be done differently, but you got the job done. So congratulations, you win. And as you grow over time, you start to learn how to, okay, I could create a method out of this and not have to have quite so many arguments. And then you start to learn how to make your code better over time, but not getting caught up in the, I have to be perfect day one, and I have to somehow figure out what the perfect way is, because there isn't a perfect way. And that's only going to, programming will never stop. I don't think we'll ever arrive at the conclusions, because it's too fast. The world changes. I have people tell me like they want .NET to slow down. And I'm like, but do you? Because the world is changing. You want new features, you want new systems, you want new ways of doing things, but you're like, at the same time, stop moving forward. And it's like, well, you can't have both. I mean, AI is here, integrating AI into your platform is here. It's going to happen. It's going to be something that the next 6 months, year is going to be more and more prevalent. And right now it's the wild west of what's going on, how it works. And like I said, kind of like your electrical illustration. Right now we have no standards. We'll have them eventually, but we've got to learn how to figure that out on the fly. And the big deal right now is, again, getting back to, does it work? Okay. Now let's figure out how to get better, and we'll iterate over time. But the big deal is, hey, get the job done.
That's a good point. Even in buildings or housing, if it's just you and your housing requirements could be a 10 by 15 room, and that's, or in Japan sometimes they get the really small living quarters. But if you're going to have thousands of people moving through a building every day, then everything changes. Your bathroom, you might have like, a roll of toilet paper and a towel. But if you, like the convention centers that have tons of traffic, they've got specialized hand drying stations, because just putting some towels on some rods in a convention center is not going to hold up for that level of complexity. You have different stresses at different levels, and so you need more structure to the software so that it doesn't just fall in on itself. But you're right. If you have 1 or 2 users internal to a company, pretty much anything will work.
Right. Yeah, I have some really janky applications currently running for myself.
Yeah.
So I have a standing station I teach at, and at the end of it, I rip out the audio and I move it to a certain file. I rename it, and some other things. They're just repetitive tasks. And again, I'm lazy, so I automated that. But it's a console application. It's just weird. Like I just wrote like gobs of code and just said like, that's good enough, because that's all it needed. It didn't need to have this nice polish and an update path and all that. Forget that. It's just an exe that I didn't even publish. I just, put it all in one exe and called it good.
Yeah. I remember back in 2005-ish, there was a derogatory term that people were using for over-engineered software. They called it enterprisey, because it was all these patterns. I don't know if you remember that. All these patterns that people would throw in that were just overkill for the job. And the code would be spread out all over the place. Why? Because someday we're going to need it. And enterprisey software, it was just over the top, gold plated to an unnecessary level.
Well, that's something that I think that universities are doing as well, is they're pushing that, because it's easy to test. So I get a lot of people that ask me for design pattern courses. I want a design pattern course. And I've really leaned away from it, because I will do it at some point. But the reality is, I don't want people to think, okay, in order to be a software developer, I have to know all these design patterns and know what the names are and how they work. I'm like, that stuff flushes itself out as you go. Like at some point, you're like, I need a solution for this. And you're like, oh, there's a pattern that helps me with that. Or maybe even create that pattern kind of, and you're like, oh, wait, I'm already using that pattern.
And the patterns end up getting embedded in libraries over time. The good ones do.
Yep. So yeah, it's
That's good, man. We could go on for hours, I'm sure, but kind of at the end of our time here, I just want to plug your stuff. You got your YouTube channel. I am Tim Corey. For people who are, want to learn to program, whether they're, going to some college courses or whatnot, what's your favorite? What are your favorite courses right now? Because you got a ton of stuff, so people could drown just waiting. But what's your favorite?
Right now, what we've done is we've set up. So when I started teaching software development, I created courses. I kind of just created whatever course you needed. And we started to actually put a path in place instead of just having random whatever. Because when you're already a software developer, you kind of know what you need. Like you said, you know the questions to ask, and you're like, oh, I need this, and I'll have a course on that. And so you just go take that course. But if you don't know, we created the master courses. So if you're like, I don't know what to do, I have 2 right now. I have a C# master course, and that's, hey, you walk in day 1, you have no clue, no problem. I start with, let's install Visual Studio, and which options do you need? We talk through every option. I don't think you'll need this one, but you can if you want. We'll talk through all the different options and how to get back to that if you ever decide you want to change. Because even that can be intimidating. I mean, Microsoft is not known for having 2 options. They're known for having 2,000 options, and putting terms around that you have no clue what they are. So, we start from that, and we go all the way through to even career advice and getting a job. And I do the same thing with web development. I see a lot of people in web development that say, oh, HTML is easy. And sure, if you're just saying H1 paragraph, then that seems easy. But there's a lot to it, especially now with HTML5 and CSS3. And so I create a course that's like, let's get a good foundation in the web, and knowing how to make accessible web, and knowing how to make a performant web, and knowing how to make it SEO friendly, and all the rest of the stuff. And again, starting off from, I know nothing, to let's install VS Code and what VS Code is, and what HTML is, what the theories are behind this. And then let's talk about where we are today, because where we are today is not where we were 10 years ago. 10 years ago was the Wild West of the web, and it was ugly. And now we have a lot of stability. And so, my master course is the place to start, because, you start there, you'll get the ability to do the job. And then from there, you know which questions to ask about. Okay, I need to add in SQL. Well, I got a SQL course. I need to add in, Azure. I got a course in Azure. So, we just add in different pieces.
Okay, awesome. Wow. We just scratched the surface, but I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing with us, and all you do for helping programmers learn how to come into the field and also grow and progress. That is, hugely needed in our field. So, but it was so great visiting with you today. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.